Hi everybody. Um, I'm Mark Turner, the External Relations Director of SRM 360, and welcome to our live discussion on whether solar geoengineering might help or harm the Amazon. For those who haven't joined us before, our goal is to support an informed discussion about sunlight reflection methods, also known as solar radiation modification or SRM, and why we've reached a point where these ideas are being considered, how these interventions might affect a variety of climate impacts in a warming world. We at SRM 360 don't take a position on whether SRM should be deployed or not, but we do support its research and broad-based discussions on the best way forwards. This is a controversial topic. Emission cuts remain the priority to tackle the root cause of climate change. However, the current trajectory is alarming, and a growing number of scientists are asking whether additional strategies may be needed to avoid catastrophic harm, including solar geoengineering. We're also facing a global biodiversity crisis, a potential sixth mass extinction. Could some of these tools have a role to play? Many people have deep and understandable concerns about this discussion. Some feel the very idea of SRM is inimical to nature. But today, we want to explore whether there might be another way of looking at it. Could SRM potentially be a temporary tool to help protect nature from the harms of rising temperatures while decarbonisation ramps up? So thank you again for coming. We hope you enjoy the discussion. Please, if you look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A chat. Please go in there and ask questions. And halfway through the meeting and at the end, I will direct those questions to the panelists. And if you could keep those to questions, short question formats, that would be very helpful. And I'll now turn over to Pete, our editorial director. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. So if Kerry could fire up our first slide, we will see that with Brazil hosting the upcoming 30th Conference of the Party, just going to show you their logo, of the 30th Conference of the Party of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, also known as COP30, we thought it would make sense to focus on the threats faced by the Amazon rainforest. In particular, we want to look at the importance of climate change to its future, and to what extent current climate strategies are enough to avert catastrophic harm, or whether additional strategies might be needed. Now, the Amazon is about twice the size of India. While most of it is in Brazil, it spans several other countries in South America. And yeah, it's one of the most biodiverse places on Earth, home to about 10% of the world's species. It's also home to tens of millions of people, including over 2 million indigenous people. It also has about 400 billion trees, storing hundreds of billions of tons of carbon. But the Amazon's under threat. As you can see in those red patches, the forested area of the Amazon has fallen by about 15% since the 1970s, mainly due to deforestation for agricultural expansion, but it's also threatened due to climate change. Looking ahead, the Amazon's future is uncertain. If global warming and deforestation continue to worsen, it could potentially reach a tipping point. We'll talk about this in a bit more detail, but the Amazon has a kind of self-sustaining cycle of rain. Water evaporates from the ocean and rains on the continents. But in the case of the Amazon, the action of the vegetation is so potent that much of that water is re-evaporated so that it can rain further downwind, keeping the interior of the continent wet enough to maintain the rainforest. But if the rainforest continues to be deforested, the forest continues to be impacted by climate change, we could lose much of that recycling potential, drying out the continent and removing the capacity for the Amazon to maintain itself. So that could potentially lead to a dieback and a flip from a forest into a savanna-like state. We'll talk more about that later. So given the slow progress on emissions cuts and the growing threat of climate change, there is growing interest in considering some interventions like stratospheric aerosol injection, which might help reduce the risks of climate change. So this is a proposal, we've heard us talk about this before if you've come to our previous ones, where small, tiny particles will be dispersed in the atmosphere, reflect a little light, and cool the planet. So one of the questions is, to what extent could this help? And joining us today to discuss this are several experts on the Amazon, solar geoengineering, and the governance challenges these ideas pose. We have Dr. Thelma Krug, who studied the Amazon as an observational scientist for many years. acted as vice chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, and represented Brazil in the UNFCCC. And she now chairs the Global Climate Observing System under the World Meteorological Organization. Phew, a lot of acronyms there. Then we have Professor Peter Cox, director of the Global Systems Institute at the University of Exeter. He is an Earth System scientist who was awarded a CBE in the King's, I'm not quite sure what that stands for, in the King's Birthday Honor List for services to science and climate modeling. And finally, we have Dr. Marcos Regis de Silva, director of policy engagement at the Degrees Initiative. Previously, Marcos worked as the executive director of the Inter-American Institute for Global Change Research, IAI, and worked on two very relevant international treaties, including the Amazon Cooperation Treaty Organization and the Convention on Biological Diversity. Now, before I turn to the discussion and turn to our guests, I'd like to quickly ask the audience something. So, Kerry, if you could get our first poll up. The question will be, will current climate strategies of emissions cuts, adaptation, and carbon dioxide removal be enough to prevent catastrophic harm to the Amazon? Certainly, likely, unlikely, or very unlikely. Let's wait a minute or so for people's answers to get in, and then we'll turn to our guests, or panelists even. Can we see those results, Kerry? Well, there we go. Pretty pessimistic outlook from our audience here. Most saying unlikely and some saying very unlikely. Okay, great. Well, Thelma, now if I could turn to you. You spent much of your career observing and studying the Amazon. What does the Amazon mean to you? Not only as like a physical ecosystem, but in emotional terms.
Oh, thanks, Peter. And hello, everybody. It's very nice to be here. Well, I think that if, when we are very young, we already know that the Amazonian forest is the largest in the world. So we care about it. But then when we grow up, then we start to be introduced not only to the vast amount of forest that you have there, but also to all the properties that the forest has. Most important to us is that most of our agriculture is rain-fed. So it depends largely on the amount of rain that comes from the Amazonian forest through the evapotranspiration. So creating all the water vapor that feeds, the rain in particular in the central part of Brazil. And so my entire career, I think, started with in the forest, in the Amazonian forest, looking it from the sky. So Brazil uses a lot of remotely sensed data. So we know the changes that we observe in the forest. So I started my career as looking at the deforestation, and my institute, the National Institute for Space Research, being the responsible agency for providing the legal, the official, let's say, deforestation rates as it stands until today. So we have the largest time series of deforestation in the entire world. So obviously the Amazon is very close to my heart since very early days, and now more prominently in my whole career.
Yeah. And how's that deforestation data looking in the kind of big picture sense?
Well, that's an interesting thing, Pete, because we have concentrated most of our deforestation estimates in the Amazon. So Amazonia has the largest time series, a consistent time series, looking, from satellite data. Now Brazil has expanded to include it to all biomes in Brazil. So the 6 biomes are now completely covered. So with that we can know if, for instance, you don't have a leakage. For instance, if we are not deforesting Amazonia, are we deforesting somewhere else? So we can control, we can monitor that, and tracking deforestation is not only deforestation. We track also degradation, which is the largest component of what happens in particular in the Amazonia. But obviously, Amazonia, because of all the huge storage, vast amount of carbon in there, its role in the biodiversity, its role, as I said, in terms of generating the rain we need for agriculture, I think has a very close eyes into it. And so we are being very successful in terms of creating policies to reduce deforestation. We have done that in the past from 2004 to 2012 to reduce basically 80% of the deforestation in the Amazonia. And then, it changed and started to be large again. It depends very much on the government that you have. And we didn't happen to have a very good government that was caring much for, having the Amazon preserved or conserved. But now we are getting back and being very successful in reducing the deforestation and hopefully in the degradation as well.
Excellent, thanks. Now, I mean, Peter, Thelma brought up the massive carbon sequestration potential of the Amazon. Can you talk a little about that? Give us a kind of a global sense of how significant the Amazon is. We often hear it referred to as the lungs of the planet. Is it really that important? Can you give us a rough sense, Peter?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of carbon, we estimate probably 10 to 20 years of global CO2 emissions are stored in Amazon vegetation soil. So it's a big number. Of course, the key thing, I think, from a sort of climate point of view, Thelma and you have both already touched on, Pete, which is this recycling ability to recycle water, which is what sustains the climate there and across large parts of the tropics. So there's a double whammy, really, when you lose the forest. You lose carbon from the system and a current sink for carbon, which is taking some of our emissions. And you also take away that ability to recycle water in a way that nothing else can, really.
Yeah, and I presume this is not just the Amazon that does this, but the whole tropical rainforest system across the world.
It is. I think the Amazon is the most significant part of it, and it's the bit we're most concerned about with regard to climate change. So the primary threat, as you've both pointed out, is deforestation, degradation. But even if we can stop that and progress is being made, climate change poses a risk, as far as we can tell from looking at complex climate models and what they predict.
Yeah.
Great. We'll talk a little more about that in a minute. But Marcos, we're also in a global biodiversity crisis as well as a climate crisis. How critical is the Amazon to global biodiversity, and what threats does it face?
When you speak of the Amazon, it's good to divide it into two categories: one of absolute awe, and the other one of statistics and science. It's the most biologically diverse region. It's more than half of the tropical forests. There's about 39 million people that live in the region, which is 11% of the 8 Amazon countries. There's over 420 different indigenous peoples speaking 86 languages and 650 dialects. It's a unique ecosystem with a fourth of all known species. Between 5 to 30 million species, of which only 1.4 million are described. So I could go on and on to discuss its importance in relation to biodiversity. But I think what we're facing right now is that we have a fragmented environmental governance. We have 6 global biodiversity conventions, and one is not even UN. It's Ramsar, which is wetlands. They all touch on the governance of the Amazon. I think there's more coherence that's required and a more understanding. If you look at the submissions by countries, you'll see that almost every single instrument has raised concern for more synergies between the conventions and UNEP, for example, so that they're able to work more coherently. You see this again with UNFCCC, the Climate Change Convention, and the Convention on Biological Diversity. More cohesiveness, more synergies, being able to understand the loops between climate change and biodiversity. So with your question, it's the whole issue of biodiversity in the Amazon is huge, right? What we have in wealth there is basically unknown. I'd also like to say that the governance voice for the 8 countries of the Amazon is the Amazon Cooperation Treaty Organization. Now, we can question its effectiveness, its work, but that is the legal, how can I say, the legal context with which a lot of the countries negotiate or compromise with issues related to the Amazon. For example, they're planning a presidential summit at COP30, which I think is very important to see what the vision, how that is articulated. So just to make a long answer even longer, biodiversity in the Amazon is extremely complex. The governance is fragmented. Much more synergies are required. And I think the electorates of the 8 Amazon countries should push for a more cohesive approach to adaptation and mitigation in the area.
Yeah, so thank you, Marcus. Turning back to Thelma, I mean, you mentioned this briefly before, but the Amazon's not only this wonderful treasure to be preserved, it's also an opportunity for some for agricultural expansion, economic expansion. What are some of the tensions around that in Brazil?
Well, yes, obviously, I think it is important also to say that, the amount of forest that we have lost is about 22% of the forest, which is a lot. I mean, but there is a lot there preserved. And basically in Brazil, it's a little bit different from other countries that do the conversion of the forest to agriculture. We do it for pasture. And we do it first for pasture and then convert that to agriculture. And then we leave the land aside for a certain period of time, and then we come back to agriculture. But we never saw too much of the GDP of Brazil being very much affected by that, by the changes that we might have in terms of the agriculture in the specific areas of Amazonia. As a matter of fact, agriculture is much more profitable in previously deforested areas than in new deforested areas. It is very expensive for one to put down the forest and create the environment for the agriculture, even more difficult than for pasture. So we do see that Brazil has a lot of degraded land that can be exploited, and it's doing that. But on another issue, I think that Brazil has made, in particular, the president of Brazil now, Lula, has made the commitment to deforestation zero in Brazil by 2030. I find that that is a big challenge for Brazil. And obviously it depends on potentially on resources to avoid areas that could be legally deforested in Amazonia, not to be deforested, to keep it standing up. As you know, or may not know, 80% of forest, 80% of the forest in private properties in Amazonia need to be left standing. But if the property has more than 80%, then it could suppress that vegetation, that native forest. But Brazil is looking for incentives, not even to have that part of the forest being put down. And this is why during COP30, it is creating this TFFF fund, is the Tropical Fund for Conservation of Forests, which is a long time due, finance for countries that are maintaining their forests standing. So with that, compromise and commitment of Brazil, I think that we understand very clearly that the impact on our economy is not going to be that big, if any.
Great, thanks so much. I think that tees up the question I had for Marcos. I believe, well, correct me if I'm wrong, but that partnership around funding for forests, is that something that remote nations could do? Because obviously the rainforest is only in certain countries, but what role could other countries, Germany, the UK, US, play in helping maintain the Amazon and other rainforests?
I had an interesting conversation with the French ambassador when I was leading the IEI, and he just looked at me and said, France is an Amazonian country. And that struck me because I've never heard it so clearly before that a European country had that much interest in the Amazon. I believe that other countries, especially the donors, should pay more attention to the Amazon, should see the very important efforts that Thelma described. Because remember, you invest in the Amazon and you're not investing elsewhere in Brazil. It's still a lot of poverty. There still needs a incredible social needs. There are incredible tensions. We have a very decentralized federation in Brazil. So it makes a number of decisions, very complex and very challenging. I think making funding and making support for the efforts that are being taken is of the utmost concern. And I think this is where parties should take a more proactive approach elsewhere than in Latin America. And this doesn't mean confrontation. It means a partnership of equals, understanding the challenges that the area has.
Yeah. And so, Peter, looking to those longer term challenges for the Amazon, I mean, we talked quite a bit about deforestation, and a little about climate change. How bad could things get? I mean, I know you've worked on this potential for an Amazon dieback. Can you just sort of give us a sense of the scale of the threat and how close we might be to some dieback
Yeah, I
event?
mean, actually, the results that first got us concerned were 25 years ago now, in the first instance where we tried to couple the Earth's carbon cycle to climate and to model forests dynamically. And in those runs, we saw a tug of war, really. So what happens in models, and I think in the real world, is that there is a stimulation of carbon uptake by vegetation. Vegetation grows better in high CO2 if you've got plenty of nutrients and you've got some water. But then the climate change that's caused by the CO2 has a negative impact, generally in the tropics, because it's already near optimum temperatures for trees. And with the warming comes increased evaporation and drying. So you have this strange tug of war where CO2 enhances the sink directly and suppresses it indirectly. And in those early model runs that we did 25 years ago, there was a very catastrophic tipping point, really, which went from the Amazon absorbing carbon to releasing it, and in fact, forest dieback. So basically what happened was, even without direct deforestation, the forest became less and less sustainable in the high CO2 world. We don't think things are quite as bad as that in the real world, for reasons that we can go into if you like. But the latest models are showing evidence of what we might call localized Amazon dieback, mediated by fire. So under climate change, when it gets hot and the dry season gets longer, you get to a situation where fire takes over, and you get this conversion to savanna you spoke about, Pete. And we see that in quite a lot of the latest Earth system models. So we are concerned about the vulnerability of the Amazon, not just to deforestation, but to climate change. And the worst thing of all is a combination of the two, I think.
Yeah. And so is there like a sense of, I mean, we're at roughly 20% deforested today. Is it, if we went to 40% deforested and then 2 Celsius, would it die back? Or do we not have the confidence to make those kind of predictions?
Sure, there are some studies by Carlos Nobre and co-workers, brilliant Brazilian scientists, that suggest there is a sort of threshold where you get to a certain level of deforestation, and this ability to sustain the water cycle is reduced so much you get further decline. What we saw in our model was something like that, but without deforestation, essentially what happened is that the forest started to die back, and therefore things downstream of it, forest downstream of it was not getting water, and that sort of led to a wave of dieback going on. So I think there is these feedback loops that sustain the forest under good conditions can also lead to it being vulnerable quite abruptly, and we are concerned about that.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thanks. Well, let's break now for a Q&A. So we've got our audience here, and I think they've been submitting some questions, but I'll hand over to Mark now to handle those.
Sure thing. We've got actually quite a few questions already diving into the SRM part of the equation, which we're going to be focusing on now. So hopefully none of these are going to... I'll pick a couple that we might not actually address in the second half. But actually, I just have one quick question first. And perhaps I could ask this to Telma. With this potential for dieback and the general sense of stress on the Amazon, how much is there in Brazil an emotional sense of emergency around this? Are people feeling a sense of this really is a big bad thing that we have to stop happening at all costs, or is it still not fully in the public consciousness?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Well, but I'm going to give you my own feeling on this, right? So I'm very emotional about this whole thing. So I'm trusting that that deforestation is going to be halted. So we are showing that not only in Amazonia, but in other biomes as well, not as efficiently, let's say, in the Cerrado, but in Amazonia, yes, we are decreasing quite impressively the deforestation. And I'm really hopeful that we are going to be able to halt that, or not to let it get to the limit of the thresholds that Peter Cox has mentioned. So I'm most worried now about decoupling, climate change from forests. And we saw that in last year we had the tremendous, amount of forest fires in Amazonia, 5 times more than usual. And we have been having a sequence of drought years, and coupled also with hot streams. So those are very inducive to the fires that we are seeing. So I'm much more concerned that what is going to happen to the Amazonia is much more related to climate change and the inability of us really putting it down. In particular, I always say deforestation accounts for 10%, 11% of the global emissions, whereas, agriculture, other 11. But if we talk about fossil fuels, it's about
Yes.
80%. So we need to cut that down. So if we don't do that, I don't think that our forests that are highly vulnerable to all these events are not going to survive. So it's not going to be because of deforestation. I am decoupling that from the dieback. And I'm not putting the blame on climate change most intensively.
Thank you. I've got one question here from Kata Karath. Perhaps this can help tee up the next session a little bit. Are there currently any ongoing solar geoengineering experiments in the Amazon region, whether Brazil, Ecuador, Peru, Colombia, at the moment? And if so, what are the preliminary results? I see you're shaking your head, Telma, but perhaps I'll pass this one to Marcos as well.
Yes.
Well, there are experiments in Latin America. They're trying to build a kernel of knowledge, because one of the problems is that we do not want to use data and information derived or generated elsewhere that are not reflective of the region's needs and priorities. But it's important to note that some of the lessons learned from these preliminary projects that are occurring in Latin America may have lessons for the Amazon. But the one thing that I would like to focus both on your previous questions, or what countries outside of the region can do, and ways forward, is the need for more research in the region, particularly in the Amazon. We have very good capacity in South America and elsewhere in the Western Hemisphere. Thelma is one of our outstanding scientists. I can mention Paulo Artaxo, Maria Inez Canelone. I mean, the list just goes on and on. What is needed is access to the resources that may not be available in the region. High-speed cloud computing, for example, things like that. And this is where the resources from outside can generate interest and support with greater understanding for what is occurring, because the level of unknowns is very, very high.
Thank you.
Great.
One other, just with regards to, perhaps you could just bear these in mind as we go through the next section, but I'll just read them out anyway. Ben Russell asks, the Amazon is huge, but would it benefit from a more local or regional climate intervention? So let's bear that one in mind as we get to the next section. The other question has, yes, there's one question that Arthur Dahl has actually posed and been answered by Peter Cox in the thing. Will reduction in solar radiation impact photosynthesis and this source of chemical energy for all the food chain, including agriculture?
Great.
Great, Pete.
Great. Well, we'll certainly cover that other one in a bit more detail with Peter in a minute. Mark, I just wanted to clarify. I think the question was about solar geoengineering experiments, and I think they might have meant outdoor experiments.
Outdoor
You were mainly
experiments.
referring to climate modeling research, though, right? In
That's right.
South
Yes.
America. Okay, cool. Just wanted to clarify that. Great. Well, let me move
So
on.
there's no outdoor experiments at the moment. Is that correct?
That's in the Amazon, I believe that's correct, or at least that we know of. But again, it's very difficult to understand what is happening in the Amazon via research. You have
Okay.
universities, you have development banks, you have different UN entities, you have foundations, you have NGOs, and there's very little cohesiveness and communication on the number of research and different attempts that are being made.
Okay, thanks. Right, well, let's open up for another poll. So Carrie will be firing this up. Yeah, and I'd like to, oh, here we go. If stratospheric aerosol geoengineering were deployed to offset the next 1 Celsius of global warming, how would this affect the Amazon? Now, we've not given you a great deal to go on here, but what's your rough sense? Would it help a little, help a lot, harm a little, or harm a lot? Let's see. We'll be asking this one again at the end after we've heard a bit more from our panelists. I see that's amused you, Thelma. Okay, great. Well, let's see what people think. Carrie. So here we go. Pretty mixed. Pretty mixed. Well, let's see. Okay, cool. So right. So COP30 is going to mark 10 years since the Paris Climate Agreement. The first global climate agreement that bound countries to tell each other how much they were going to cut emissions. But since then, emissions have continued to rise, albeit at a slower rate than before. And temperatures are already nudging their way across the 1.5 Celsius temperature threshold set at that meeting. So, Marcos, given this and the fact that the impacts of climate change continue to worsen, should we expect solar geoengineering to come up at COP30?
It's not in the agenda. I would be very doubtful if it enters formal negotiations. If anything happens, I think it'll be in the side events and presentations, but I doubt there has been a certain level of hesitancy by the UNFCCC to take on SRM. And ironically enough, it has been the Convention on Biological Diversity, its sister Rio Convention, that has adopted the most decisions on that topic.
Yeah. And you'd think, I mean, I look across these other things. The other one that's very general is the UN Environment Program, UNEA. Are there other places where this might be better taken up, or is the UNFCCC the logical place where it should be taken up?
Again, you have a fragmented environment for decision making, and it's very difficult to say UNFCCC, the WMO, UNEA. UNEA is more policy, for example. WMO is more geared towards science. It has the
and that's the World
Lighthouse
Meteorological Organization.
That's right, the World Meteorological Organization. In my view, what will eventually happen is this issue gains enough attention. I think there will be serious discussion on the establishment of a protocol. But this is roulette, right? I can't say for sure if that'll happen or not, and under which instrument that would happen.
So just to clarify, when you say protocol and instrument, can you give us an example of what you might mean by that?
I'm sorry, I'm speaking in our jargon. Think of a convention, a multilateral agreement. The CBD, for instance, has several protocols. They established one for living modified organisms, another one for the Nagoya Protocol on genetic resources, which allows discussions to be focused under those protocols, but a much greater umbrella, which is the Convention on Biodiversity. A protocol is subservient to the main treaty. So my gut feeling is if the SRM gains enough attention, enough concern, perhaps a multilateral treaty or an organization like the WMO may establish a protocol or an instrument to better focus discussion. But again, this is roulette. I'm not absolutely, it could continue to be completely fragmented the way it is in a patchwork of different decisions.
Yeah. So, Thelma, you recently organized an event on solar engineering with Brazilian researchers as well as some government representatives, in which we played a small role helping develop some of the materials. Why do you think it was important for Brazil to address this issue at this time, or to learn more about it?
Yeah, thanks, Peter. And also, I need to acknowledge it was not a small help. It was a big help that SRM 360 has given to us. So, and mainly the workshop we did, it was a one-day workshop, which was meant for representatives from governments, from the government of Brazil. And the idea started by understanding that there is so little research being done in the global south, so little. And in Brazil, we have three initiatives. Two of them are socioeconomic elements of SRM, and another one is really physical impacts of SRM. But so it is important that if we, at some point in time, this issue will come to the table of governments. It's not the right time now. So I agree this should not be brought to the UNFCCC because there is a huge lack of communication. Governments do not understand what this is. They do not understand, and that was the reason for the workshop. They do not understand the implications that they, through their researchers, understanding going to impact their ecosystems, their health, their agriculture, and so on. So in my view as a researcher, and I did that also with Paulo Artacho, our view is that we need to establish research in Brazil to understand the implications, trying to see if we can run our own models with our own data. And so that when this comes to the table at any forum for decision, we know what to do. We know what the decision has to be taken. But informed decision, informed, and domestically informed decisions, and not, inheriting the results and the results of the models without knowing the assumptions, without knowing exactly how the results have been obtained. So this is our plea. So we don't know, we are working with the Minister of Science, Technology, Innovation to see if they want to include that as one of the elements that they think is relevant to be pursued, including with sufficient funding for this. So the idea is we need to improve communications not only in Brazil. I think that the Global South needs to understand better. We saw during this workshop that the largest amount of funding for SRM is going to the Global North. So if I remember well the pictures, it would be like for 12 projects in the Global North, an allocation of $188 million, whereas for 22 projects in the Global South, only 2 million. So there is a huge discrepancy in terms of understanding the needs of the Global South. So I think that we need to bring that to surface and to be matured enough, both in global and South, to understand how this thing can really be put, to the table to be discussed. Obviously, research is one thing that we think we also, as SRM, we don't invoke to the deployment of. We are discussing, for instance, outdoor experiments, small scale, to validate the results of the models, to understand better the assumptions, and move from there.
Okay,
Obviously, there is a
thanks.
fear that if you bring that to the political, like COP30, you could have this moral hazard, understanding that if we're talking about these things, it is because we are going to be absolutely unable to minimize, global warming as we should be focusing on.
Great. Well, we'll get back to some of those big concerns at the end briefly. But talking about research, well, we've been discussing the Amazon And it's an area I've been really concerned about when it comes to solar geoengineering, because I've seen several studies reporting that stratospheric aerosol injection, or SAI, might fail to address climate change's drying effect on the Amazon, and that it might make it a bit drier. But Peter, you've recently published a preprint, so not a final paper, but a preprint in Earth System Dynamics, and we'll put the link in the chat here. And in it, you and your colleagues look at how SAI could affect the Amazon and plant life on land more broadly. I said it's not been through peer review yet, but can you give us the headline conclusions? Did SAI help or hurt the Amazon?
It helped. So we looked at it in these runs. They were GeoMIT runs, so there were a number of climate modeling groups doing these runs. In fact, we looked at 5 system models. The work was carried out by my PhD student, Isabel Parry, but large group of co-authors. We looked at how SAI injection in a model, or in these 5 models, in fact, to go from a high emission scenario to a moderate emission scenario would affect the land, the carbon cycle, and especially the Amazon.
And just when you say a model, can you clarify what you mean by that?
So these are called Earth system models, but they're basically climate models that also include the way forests and the land in general responds to climate change in terms of picking up carbon or releasing it. So
great big computer simulations on fast supercomputers.
Yeah, so they're very complex models, and they have uncertainty in them, of course, which is why we look at a number of them to see. In general, what we found was that the SAI in these models reduced the temperatures as it was designed to do globally and in the Amazon, and actually led to additional carbon uptake and additional net primary productivity relative to both a world in which we didn't do SAI, but we had high emissions. And in that world, carbon dioxide is high. And as I said before, productivity tends to be higher in the models and in the real world as well, I think. And relative to a world in which we got to this moderate emission scenario just through conventional mitigation. So the first one was due to the fact that relative to the high emission scenario without SAI, you were removing some damaging climate change. The second one was relative to the moderate climate change, the more moderate climate change in the middle of the road scenario, you were reducing the impacts of climate change on the negative impacts of climate change in the tropics. And both of them led to additional carbon storage relative to the unmitigated scenario. There were differences across the models, but there was quite a lot of agreement in the Amazon region in particular that, at least in terms of carbon stored on the land and net primary productivity, which is the growth rate of plants, it was beneficial. And that was slightly surprising because we were reducing shortwave at the surface. We were slightly reducing across the region rainfall, but we were also reducing evaporation a lot and reducing temperatures a lot.
So let's run through this. So shortwave is a climate scientist way of saying sunlight. Just to clarify, I really, it's one of these terms I really don't know why everyone uses it. It seems so weird to me. But anyway, sunlight. So I guess let's think of those big factors in turn. So SAI would work by reducing the amount of sunlight coming in. So we're talking something like per 1 Celsius of cooling, it's about a 1% reduction. You'd think that would have quite an impact, but is that a big factor?
It isn't, partly because in places that with dense vegetation, the limiting factor is not light, really, especially in the tropics. It's to do with space and it's to do with nutrients quite often, and sometimes water. So it doesn't have a huge impact. In the models, definitely not a huge impact. But what you do get is benefits from reducing the warming, which is detrimental when you're already at an optimum temperature for photosynthesis, which is what it's like in the tropics.
Now, the one that was a bigger, and we talked a bit about CO2, so we're talking simulations where CO2 is doubled or whatever from pre-industrial conditions. And that obviously being a crucial input to plants, that's going to have a big impact and a beneficial impact overall, like the direct effects.
Yeah, it does in general. So it does depend on how limited the response to CO2 is by nutrients. And in the Amazon, at least in the mature Amazon forest, it's very good at recycling nutrients. Phosphorus is the limiting factor, but it's very well recycled. So it does depend a bit on that. But in general, models predict and actually simulate that the carbon sink in the Amazon is largely due to CO2 and is counteracted by the effects of climate change. And so if you get one without the other, you get a net benefit, actually.
And for climate change, I mean, one of the things that's a big difference or a big concern I had was you reduce temperature, but you also change rainfall patterns. You might lead to an Amazon that gets less rain coming in. But how did those two effects weigh up? The rainfall changes that I mean, am I right that it didn't offset those or made some of them worse? Like, how do you describe the rainfall changes you saw?
So the rainfall changes. One of the issues about the Amazon is that it's where the intense rainfall in the tropics, we call the intertropical convergence zone, the ITCZ, how that moves under climate change is rather critical. And in a paper that we published in 2008 with Brazilian colleagues, including Carlos Nobre, we showed actually that the aerosols that we've been putting out in the northern hemisphere as pollutants had probably suppressed warming in the northern hemisphere and slightly maintained the intertropical convergence zone over the Amazon. So we sort of know that it depends a lot on where you do the SAI. In this case, it was uniform across the globe. There was some movement of the intertropical, this very strong rainfall band, but the net effect was that the reduced temperatures, therefore the reduced evaporation, counteracted any reductions in rainfall in the models. And so the net effect was that it was a positive impact on carbon storage and primary production, which was a surprise.
Yeah, and you found that across the world, didn't you? That it was not just in the Amazon, but across the planet that there was this general response.
So one of the things is that if you warm up the climate, you tend to increase decomposition rates. You know, like taking your cheese out of the fridge, see how fast it goes off. Things just decay more quickly in higher temperatures. So one of the things we see in climate models, in Earth system models, is that as you warm up the planet, decomposition of the soil goes up and carbon comes out of the soil, and that accelerates global warming by more CO2 in the air. So that's one of the key things you get. And you see that uniformly in models, is that if you cool them down, you get more carbon stored on the land. So you get some mitigation of climate change by that mechanism.
Yeah. Well, thanks a lot. Thelma, what are your reactions to Peter's study?
Well, let's see. My concerns or my reaction. Obviously, models are models, right? So you have assumptions, and I don't know if there's system models characterizes all the changes, like, for instance, restoration, secondary vegetation, or other inputs that normally are not into those models. But I don't know exactly the models that Peter Cox has used or other increments to the model. My concern with SAI is that it has to be global. Right, it's something that you can do locally, right? So that worries me a little bit, because I don't know, the implications to the forest might be positive, but I don't know if the implications to agriculture at large, or to health, or to the ozone layer, how would that be impacted? So I think that this is why we need a lot of research going on still. And IPCC was very clear to put that down in the latest report in the previous cycle. So, so that is it is my concern. The second concern I have is that is on the termination effect. So once we start with SAI, we might need to maintain it running, or modifying the amount of radiation that reaches the land for a quite long period of time. Some anticipate that it should be 100 years time. So depending on how and this termination effect would happen, if it would happen, then we could have an effect that would be largest amount of warming instead of the cooling, the land. So these are some concerns that I have, and that I think that this is why I think that research needs to be done, and domestically, to improve our knowledge on these things.
Excellent. Well, I see we've got quite a lot of questions now come in for the second half. So I'll turn back to Mark, who will shepherd those questions towards you.
That's great. Thank you. So one important question, and perhaps I'll address this to Marcos. Where are the indigenous people in this conversation? Asks Akaluk Blatchford. Tribal representatives, indigenous knowledge keepers, indigenous scientists. I'm reading the question here. What is your disaster plan for failure if deployed? What kind of plan do you have for climate refugees who'll be displaced? I don't know if you could address that, Marcos?
The climate refugees, no, but I would say that there is increasing awareness of the inherent rights of indigenous peoples and their communities throughout many of the multilateral agreements. if you look at their footprint during negotiations of the Nagoya Protocol, when access to genetic resources, they're all over the place. And if you compare that to the 1970 environmental treaty still in force, like the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, they're largely absent. So there is a recognition that their input is required. There's also a decision in the CBD. I can't remember if it's under 1314 or one of them that does recognize the need for input into indigenous
The
peoples.
CBD is the conventional
The
biological
conventional biological diversity that requires input from indigenous peoples in all of this process. I was also in a meeting in Bogota 2 weeks ago where we had an indigenous representative who was the head of the Indigenous Peoples Advisory Committee to the II, the Inter-American Institute for Global Change Research. And she emphasized very strongly the need for free, prior, and informed consent on any SRM outdoor experiment or large-scale deployment over indigenous territories. So we need to have incredible sensitivity to their needs. I don't want to say obligations under an international treaty because it's very difficult to enforce a decision, but let's say the respect that we should have for the decisions taken with regard to indigenous rights and the very need to involve their voices in any decision-making related to SRM.
Thank you. I've got a couple of questions here from Tom Harris. Are there concerns about ocean acidification reducing cloud formation over the oceans due to lowered biogenic aerosols and lowering rainfall? If so, does SRM help? And then there's another question. How quickly do the panel think SAI, this is maybe a practical one and a governance one, think SAI to reduce temperatures by 0.5 degrees C could be carried out earlier or later than 2050? If we exceed 2.5 degrees C by then, will it be too late? If we focus on that last one, Peter, do you have any initial reactions to that in terms of the engineering side of it and the governance side of it?
The engineering side is still to be sorted out, and I think there are various ways you might imagine doing aerosol injection for sure. Once it's done, though, the impact is almost immediate. We know this from the impact volcanoes have had on climate in the past. For example, the Pinatubo eruption that cooled the climate down. So we sort of know that once it's done, it will act quickly. Could it be done? Will it be too late if we get to 2050? I don't think we know, to be honest. We are concerned that we're approaching tipping points, one of them to do with the Amazon. But what's clear is if you have this facility, you wouldn't have to use it immediately. We hope you'd be able to use it only in the event of an emergency. So you have something in your back pocket in the case that the tipping points arrive sooner than you thought. The governance is incredibly complex and difficult, as people have spoken about. And the main thing is it just needs to be talked about, because at the moment it's not properly spoken about within the climate community, I don't think. Yeah, so the answer to that one is once it was done, once you could get aerosols in, the impact would be almost immediate.
But then there's this this element, if we exceed 2.5 degrees by the time this is carried out, will it be too late? Of course, will it be too late is a very big question. Too late for what? But I guess with respect to issues like Amazon dieback and
yeah, we don't know where the threshold is. So we're not likely to know with any sort of accuracy before it arrives upon us. So we are developing techniques to work out when you might know you've gone over a threshold, even though you're not committed to change. And then if you had something as an emergency measure that you could use it because it's fast. There are issues to do with, so the Amazon forest probably would be, I think, based on what we've looked at, would be protected by immediate cooling under those circumstances. But there are other tipping points where that wouldn't happen, where, for example, you've got a slower process in the system. In those, you don't need an emergency measure so much. The Amazon forest is relatively fast to react compared to, say, the main circulation in the ocean.
Thank you very much. Telma, I'm going to put this one to you. It's a follow-up from Kata Karath, and I think maybe this is a chance also just to clarify the difference in terms of models which is essentially scientists looking at computers and working out what might or might not happen if you brought in certain kind of scenarios of geoengineering and comparing that to what would happen under climate change. And the outdoor experiments, which is actually includes the release of potentially elements outside. Thank you for addressing my question before, she said, but could you give any more concrete examples if there are none in the Amazon, then in other parts of Latin America? I would love to know if there are any outdoor pilot projects in the region that might have applicable results to the Amazon. Thelma, do you have any answer on that?
No, not really. Obviously, we have lots of articles, including from Carlos Nobre, that Peter Cox has been mentioning, anticipating for many years the dieback that we could have in the Amazon. We have been discussing that there is a scientific committee, providing some support to the presidency of the COP, who has been addressing the tipping points and the dieback in particular. And there is an interesting thing as well, Mark, because we have been talking about the Amazon, but we have to be aware that impact might not be only over the Amazon forest, but it also may impact other tropical forests. And one question that I posed to the group was exactly this: why we are focusing on Amazonia if you have a big forest also in the DRC? And then the answer was immediate: because we don't have enough data. That was the first answer. And the second one was that, their own formation, the structure of the forest is different, which makes some being more resilient to more warming than other forests. And I think that the forests are sometimes very, let's say, they have a behavior that sometimes we cannot anticipate. I remember that one time when we had a big forest fire in Brazil, and we visited the area and we said, oh, all these forests are going to die. And then this one will be okay. But when we went back years afterwards, the ones we said would be dead were okay. And those that we said would survive did not survive. And so we never really know how the forests react sometimes to some of these pressures. And but I don't think that it has enough time to adapt, given the speed of warming that we are experiencing now.
Davis,
yeah.
Beyonder, just to bring into that, do you have any advice for Global South countries? And also, if you would answer this briefly, and Marcos, and then we're going to have to wrap up, I think. But with regards to, can Global South, do you have advice with regards to testing SRM? Because obviously what would work for the North and the South might be the same thing. Do you have any advice on testing? And do you think it should be time, perhaps just to go back to the experiments, for the potential use of outdoor experiments in the Global South?
Mark, you're asking me? This was directed to me.
Please go.
Yes.
Either way, go ahead. Yeah, please.
I just like to remind everyone that, again, the Convention on Biological Diversity has adopted a very important decision. I invite you to read it. It's Decision 1314, and it reads, and notes that more transdisciplinary research and sharing of knowledge among appropriate institutions is needed. So there is a recognition by governments on the very crucial need for research. And we're speaking of a global community because every country in the Global South is a member of the Convention on Biological Diversity. So there is consensus on the need for research. And I'd like to emphasize what Thelma said very much, and I think has been shared by all of us, that governments need to be better informed on the consequences, on the risk of using or not using these technologies, on the research that is required to identify national priorities and needs, and also on the need to be able to allow countries in the region to reach consensus and articulate a regional voice in global fora. It's
Thank you.
absolutely missing from a
We've
region.
got to wrap up now. I think that's a great note on which to end. And actually, can extend a couple of minutes, but just for thank you so much to everybody who stayed for the hour. We'll go on for a couple of minutes at the end if we can just wrap up a last couple of questions. Please, if you want to get involved in these discussions, join us on our LinkedIn social media account and come to SRM 360. We've got lots more stuff coming, perspectives, news reactions, and so forth. So this is an ongoing discussion, isn't going to end anytime soon. So thank you so much for attending, everybody, and get in touch. Pete, did you want to wrap up?
Well, yeah, I was going to do our final poll question to see if people wanted to, if we've got a moment to get that up. Well, let's see, has people's mind has changed on this one? If stratospheric aerosol geoengineering were deployed, how would this affect the Amazon? Let's see if views have changed. But yes, thanks everyone for joining, and I guess thanks to our panelists, Thelma, Marcos, and Peter. Oh, and look at this, we've seen a shift. A little shift towards help a little. Okay. Excellent. Thanks. Well, let's close out the main recording, and we'll have a couple extra minutes for questions if there's any left over. Thanks.
Great. Thank you. Okay, here's a couple of one. Some are governance, some are technical. Maybe I'll ask this one. What about and I guess it's a practical question because people think a lot in terms of what would this look like in practice outside. What about the emissions from the flights to deliver the particle spray and also the microparticles left over? These issues need to be discussed. Peter, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, there was a thought a while back that you could just put sulfur back in airline fuel and it would all sort it out. But problem is airlines don't fly high enough. So you need something that's in the stratosphere so the aerosol lasts longer. So you'd need some mechanism to do that. High flying planes is one possibility. There's been other things like pipes that have been discussed where you'd shoot up a pipe. So there's engineering problems to be solved, but they seem to be solid. But we can fly aircraft at various levels. We ought to be able to do this. Yeah.
Well, and if I might add, I mean, I think the CO2 emissions from this fleet of jets would be pretty small. I think we're talking some low hundreds of jets, which is sort of a few percent or a percent of the global jet fleet, which contribute a few percent to global CO2 emissions. So this would be a percent of CO2 emissions, and yet it could halt global temperature rise, although with all sorts of other issues.
So I've got one question from Jeff Souchon. It's an interesting one. Could surface reflection at least be a stepping stone to SAI? I guess there's two elements of that. Could you use surface reflection ground albedo enhancement? Does that count as solar geoengineering? Could that be a way of increasing reflectivity on a large scale? And then in terms of, could that be a stepping stone to SAI? I suppose maybe could that be something that gets people used to the idea that sunlight reflection would be a component of a climate strategy? Do you have any thoughts on that? Actually, Pete, do you want to have a quick go at that one, and then we'll ask Thelma?
I'm Pete and he's Peter today.
Okay.
Oh, sorry. Pete.
Is that right?
I know you've got strong opinions, but also I saw Peter. But Pete Irvin, because I know you've got strong opinions on the issue of surface albedo,
Sure.
and yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's you've got to have a surface to make brighter, and so I think it can make a lot of sense in urban areas to make urban areas more reflective, and I think that is happening. People are making choices around construction, around urban infrastructure that make cities a little whiter and make them a little cooler. I mean, it's a technology that people have been employing for thousands of years. Scaling that up to have a planetary impact, I just don't see it happening because cities are so small relative to the rest of the planet. And anywhere that you want to make more reflective, you've got to put a surface down or change in a way that gets in the way of what other activities you're up to. So I think it might make a small contribution in small places, but I don't see it being anywhere near the same potential scale as stratospheric aerosol injection.
And Peter, you got your hand up.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I think I agree with Pete on that. In urban areas, yes, there's a small contribution. In the forest, you'd have to be doing things that would be detrimental to the forest itself in order to reflect more sunlight. You basically want to reduce the sunlight reaching the forest, which is making it too hot and dry. So there are methods that are more local. So marine cloud brightening, which is essentially just putting aerosols into clouds so that they've got more droplets and they're bright and reflect more sunlight, is being considered in modeling world at the moment, and also in some experiments. And that might involve blowing sea salt up rather than putting SO2 in the stratosphere. So there are things you can imagine doing. The non-local is good in the sense that you're not affecting everyone, like Thelma was saying. You're not affecting the whole world or the whole hemisphere. But the downside is that it introduces imbalances in the climate system that can change things like monsoons. And that's the big issue. So you need a much more sophisticated control system to do that. But I think non-local is becoming more attractive because you haven't got these global governance issues in the same sort of way.
Great. Let's finish on a question from Mohammed Mumtaz, and I'll direct this for a brief wrap up from both Marcos and Thelma. I think I know how you might answer this, but let's see. Since there is a lot of debate on SRM, do you think it is possible to go for SRM or any other such intervention as an alternative solution in the Amazon region, especially in the near future? Thelma.
No, bluntly, no. No way, not in the short term, and not until we have our own understanding of the potential impacts on other ecosystems or health or other things. So I think that until there, I don't think that anything would be viable.
And Marcos?
I would support what Thelma said very much, keeping in mind her comments that SI should be global in scope, and also how little we know region-wise and how much research we need to generate the type of data and information that's required for the policymakers here to be able to adequately make that type of decision.
Thank you. And I think I'll just share this as a comment rather than a question from Davis Buyondo. Tree seedling mortality as a result of global warming is also a big issue, says Davis Buyondo. So thank you so much, everybody, for attending and for staying on a little bit longer. Brilliant. Look forward to being in touch in the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mark.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Peter, Thelma.